Oh, long day. Yeah, a little behind. It's time to get started. There are handouts on the podium in the rear if you did not get one. If you happen to have your handout from last week and you were here last week, you know we have a little bit left to finish up with chapter 7 before we get into chapter 8 tonight. So that's where we'll begin in just a moment. But let's have a word of prayer before we begin our study. Daniel chapter 7. We were talking about this vision in chapter 7, and we focused primarily last week on the 4 beasts. And we talked about how those 4 beasts represent 4 kingdoms. We're told that in the text. And the 4 kingdoms represented by those beasts are the same 4 kingdoms that are talked about in Daniel chapter 2. The Babylonian, the Medo-Persian Empire, the Greek Empire, and the Roman Empire. And there's a lot of attention on the Roman Empire. That's our focus, and when these things are being fulfilled in chapter 7. So we talked primarily about those. We talked about how there's 10 kings rising out of that 4th empire, and one in particular. Some different possible explanations of that. But there's 2 more important elements to this vision that we want to give some attention to before we move on. The Ancient of Days and the Son of Man. So pick up with me in verse 9. Let's reread verses 9 through 14. I kept looking until thrones were set up, and the Ancient of Days took his seat. His garment was white as snow, and the hair of his head like pure wool. His throne was ablaze with flames. Its wheels were a burning fire. A river of fire was flowing and coming out from before him. Thousands upon thousands were serving him, and myriads upon myriads were standing before him. The court convened, the books were opened. Then I kept looking because of the sound of the boastful words which the horn was speaking. I kept looking until the beast was killed, and its body was destroyed and given to the burning fire. As for the rest of the beasts, their dominion was taken away, but an extension of life was granted to them for an appointed period of time. I kept looking in the night visions, and behold, with the clouds of heaven, one like a son of man was coming. And he came up to the Ancient of Days and was presented before him. And to him was given dominion, honor, and a kingdom, so that all the peoples, nations, and populations of all languages might serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion which will not pass away, and his kingdom is one which will not be destroyed. So we have these 2 elements here, the Ancient of Days. What do you think the Ancient of Days represents? God. I agree. I think it represents God. And if we think about the attributes that are seen here, one is the Ancient of Days is a king. What does he take his seat on? A throne. All right. He's served by thousands. There's myriads and myriads in the throne room attending him. We see that he's pure, I think. I think that's the idea, that a garment white as snow, hair of pure wool. I think that's the idea there. We see that he also is a judge. This is a courtroom setting also, not just a throne room. The courtroom is convened, the beasts are judged and destroyed, their dominion taken away. Even this 4th powerful beast that was especially terrifying as well. And so if you think about all those attributes apply directly to God, don't they? God is a King of Kings. That's how Nebuchadnezzar acknowledged him. He's sovereign over all creation, over all the kingdoms, as we've been talking about throughout our study. Certainly God is pure. Certainly God judges the nations, and he judges in the lives of men and rules in their lives. And so we see that the Ancient of Days judges and destroys the 4th beast, which waged war against his saints. Then we have the Son of Man. The Son of Man is presented in verse 13. And behold, with the clouds of heaven, one like a Son of Man was coming. What do you think the Son of Man might refer to? I think it refers to Jesus. I think this is clearly a reference to the Messiah and Jesus. And if you think about it, Jesus refers to himself as the Son of Man, very frequently. I think you have a few references in your handout if you still have it. In each of the Gospels, he refers to it again and again. We could go to a lot of different places, and we won't take the time to do that. He refers to himself as the Son of Man. So some will specifically say this is making reference to the ascension of Jesus after his resurrection. That could be, the idea of the clouds coming up and being presented before the Ancient of Days. That could fit if you look at Acts 1, where the ascension is recorded. But in either case, whether that's specifically contemplated or not, I think we're clearly talking about the Messiah coming during this fourth empire, and there's this connection to the everlasting kingdom being established. Verse 14, verse 14, an interesting note is that this kingdom is for who? All people, not just the Jews, not any one group. It's for all people, and we can go all the way back to really the time of Abraham and look how that's fulfilled through the Messiah, a kingdom for all people, not just Jews. So ultimate message. We said last week, we always, with these visions, we want to focus on the main message. The main things are the plain things. The plain things are the main things. I think we see that God is in control of the nations. We've seen that over and over again. You're probably tired of me saying that. But during those days, the vision points to times that are going to be dark. They're going to be bleak. But God's still in control. God is still going to be the victor. The image, the bleak picture turns to a very bright, hopeful image when God comes into the picture. And so even this powerful Roman Empire that's going to persecute his saints is not going to endure forever. And then, of course, our second big theme we've talked about again and again is the establishment of this eternal kingdom during this fourth Roman Empire. Now, I think one thing we see here, though, is that although there's an eternal, all-powerful kingdom being established, it doesn't mean that there's not going to be some opposition. All right, what do we see after Jesus ascends very early in the church? What do we see? Persecution. All right, by the Jews, the Romans. Okay, and so, yes, there is an eternal kingdom established, but there's still some opponents to that kingdom. There's still going to be some opposition, and I would say we still have opposition to that kingdom today, but there's a reassurance here for the saints. If you jump back down to verse 27, there at the end, then the sovereignty, the dominion, and the greatness of all the kingdoms under the whole heaven will be given to the people of the saints of the highest one. His kingdom will be everlasting, an everlasting kingdom, and all the empires will serve and obey him. And I think when I read all this and I think about these things, I think back to what Jesus says in the Beatitudes in Matthew 5, verse 10. Blessed are those who have been persecuted for the sake of righteousness, for theirs is what? The kingdom of heaven. So although these powers are going to oppose God's people, we know that God's in control and prevailing. And so just think for a moment as we wrap this up. If you're Daniel's still in exile. You've seen, at this point, when Daniel first comes, he's brought in that first group of exiles. But as he's been in Babylon, I don't know if he was getting constant updates about what's going on back home in Jerusalem. But I think he's certainly getting updates as, well, now there's another group of exiles coming. Now, 586, the temple's been destroyed. Jerusalem's been ransacked. You can imagine he'd be without hope. And so Judah's not specifically talked about here, but just as Babylon, Medo-Persia, just as those nations rise and fall, the same thing has happened with Judah. His own people have fallen. Their place in the world has fallen. But how much hope would it give him that this is not the end for him, for his people? There's an eternal kingdom that's being established, and God is not done. Now, we see at the end that Daniel's still alarmed, okay? So if your head's spinning now, if it was spinning last week, if it's spinning at the end of class tonight, that's okay. So is Daniel's. All right. And I think that's in part because the vision presents things that are going to come in the future that are not exactly pleasant things. Persecution, war, a lot of bad things. And so it speaks, I think, to the spiritual warfare also that's going on behind the scenes. And if you're thinking again about the position Daniel's in, we have the benefit of hindsight and history to see, oh, here's how this was fulfilled. Here's how that was fulfilled. He's maybe being told what's happening, what's going to come, but it's still hard to wrap your head around these things, right? About nations rising and falling that haven't even come onto the scene yet. And so we can imagine why it would be difficult for him to grasp. But ultimately, this should be a message of hope that God's people win and that his kingdom is the one that's going to endure forever. Any questions about chapter 7 before we move on? All right. So chapter 8. If you've read ahead, you see in the very first verse that this vision that we're going to talk about comes to Daniel in the third year of Belshazzar's reign. So that puts us 2 years later after chapter 7, which was in the first year of Belshazzar's reign. So chronologically, where does that put us if we think about the first half of Daniel? We're in between two chapters. Which are those? Yeah, in between 4 and 5, okay? Still kind of towards the end of the Babylonian reign, but while Belshazzar is still ruling. So the visions of chapter 2 and 7 have a lot to do with one another. They are covering history from the present, if you're from Daniel's perspective, the Babylonian Empire through the Roman Empire, okay, during the period which the Messiah is going to come in that fourth kingdom. But the focus is on that fourth kingdom. We're now going to focus in chapter 8. We're going to zoom in a little further. We're going to look especially at the second and third kingdoms from chapter 2 and 7. So that would be the Medo-Persian and the Greek empires. It's not apparent to you probably if you're just looking at your English Bible, but we've mentioned in the past, way back early on, that there's a language change a couple times. Chapter 1 starts off in what language? Do I remember? Hebrew, yes. So in Hebrew, chapter 1 through the first part of chapter 2 is in Hebrew. In verse 4 of chapter 2, it shifts to Aramaic. And that ends with chapter 7. All right, so now when we start in chapter 8, we're back in Hebrew. All right, we're not told why that is. I think a good guess is that chapters 2 through 7 are really concerned about these world nations, what's happening in these in the Babylonian Empire, the Persian Empire. And when we come to chapter 8, we're going to be especially focused again on the Jewish nation and going forward through the rest of the book, the kingdom of God. All right, and so I think it makes sense that we would be back in Hebrew at that point. But we're not told exactly why, but I just wanted to make that note for you. So let's read chapter 8. I like to take a few minutes to read the entire thing because I think it'll be easier for us to go through each element having already read to the end and seen the interpretation as we go along. So read with me there in chapter 8, verse 1. In the third year of the reign of Belshazzar the king, a vision appeared to me, Daniel, subsequent to the one which appeared to me previously. I looked in the vision, and while I was looking, I was in the citadel of Susa, which is in the province of Elam. And I looked in the vision, and I myself was beside the Ulai canal. Then I raised my eyes and looked, and behold, a ram which had 2 horns was standing in front of the canal. Now the 2 horns were long, but one was longer than the other, with the longer one coming up last. I saw the ram butting westward, northward, and southward, and no other beast could stand against him, nor was there anyone to rescue from his power. But he did as he pleased and made himself great. While I was observing, behold, a male goat was coming from the west over the surface of the entire earth without touching the ground, and the goat had a prominent horn between his eyes. He came up to the ram that had the 2 horns, which I had seen standing in front of the canal, and rushed at him in his mighty wrath. And I saw him come up beside the ram, and he was enraged at him, and he struck the ram and smashed his 2 horns, and the ram had no strength to withstand him. So he hurled him to the ground and trampled on him, and there was no one to rescue the ram from his power. Then the male goat made himself exceedingly great. But once he became powerful, the large horn was broken. And in its place, 4 prominent horns came up toward the 4 winds of heaven. And out of them came a rather small horn, which grew exceedingly great toward the south, toward the east, toward the beautiful land. It grew up to the heavenly lights, and some of the lights, that is, some of the stars, it threw down to the earth, and it trampled them. It even exalted itself to be equal to the commander of the army, and it removed the regular sacrifice from him, and the place of his sanctuary was overthrown. And because of an offense, the army will be given to the horn along with the regular sacrifice, and it will hurl truth to the ground and do as it pleases and be successful. Then I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to that particular one who was speaking, "How long will the vision about the regular sacrifice apply, while the offense causes horror, so as to allow both the sanctuary and the army to be trampled?" And he said to me, "For 2,300 evenings and mornings, then the sanctuary will be properly restored." When I, Daniel, had seen the vision, I sought to understand it, and behold, standing before me was one who looked like a man. And I heard the voice of a man between the banks of Ulai, and he called out and said, "Gabriel, explain the vision to this man." So he came near to where I was standing, and when I came, I was frightened, and I fell on my face, and he said to me, "Son of man, understand that the vision pertains to the time of the end." Now, while he was talking to me, I was dazed with my face to the ground, and he touched me and made me to stand in my place. And he said, "Behold, I'm going to inform you of what will occur in the final period of the indignation, because it pertains to the appointed time of the end. The ram which you saw with the 2 horns represents the kings of Media and Persia. The shaggy goat represents the kingdom of Greece, and the large horn that is between his eyes is the first king. The broken horn and the 4 horns that came up in its place represent 4 kingdoms, which will arise from his nation, although not with his power. And in the latter period of their dominion, when the wrongdoers have run their course, a king will arise, insolent and skilled in intrigue, and his power will be mighty, but not by his own power. And he will destroy to an extraordinary degree, and be successful and do as he pleases. He will destroy mighty men and the holy people, and through his shrewdness, he will make the seed of success by his influence. And he will make himself great in his own mind, and he will destroy many while they are at ease. He will even oppose the prince of princes, and he will be broken without human agency. And the vision of the evenings and mornings, which has been told, is true. Too many pages. But as for you, keep the vision secret, because it pertains to many days in the future. Then I, Daniel, was exhausted and sick for days. Then I got up and carried on the king's business, but I was astounded at the vision, and there was no one to explain it. So if you want to pass out after this, that's okay, because Daniel did as well, it seems. All right, so we have 2 main elements initially here. We have a ram and a goat, and we've already spoiled the surprise. The ram represents what? The Medo-Persian Empire. Of all the visions here, this to me is one of the, in my mind, is one of the clear, and it has one of the most explicit explanations. The imagery, as we'll see, really fits the history as these nations unfold very well. But we're told in verse 20 that the ram represents Medo-Persia. So Daniel is in Susa during this vision, or as the vision's happening. He appears in Susa, which is going to eventually become one of the capital cities of the Medo-Persian Empire. That's where the kings would have resided during the winter time. That's in modern day Iran, just so you know. The ram has 2 horns, one being longer than the other that comes up last, okay? And if you think about the Medo-Persian Empire, you had the Medes who had more power initially, but then the Persians eventually overthrew them and unified the power. So the Persian half of the Medo-Persian Empire, we would say, arises later and was the stronger half of that unified empire. Cyrus conquers the Medes, unites them, and then ended up being the stronger part of that alliance there. We see that the ram butts west, north, and south. One possible correlation there is with the direction of the conquests of Medo-Persia. To the west, they conquered Babylon and Syria. To the north, Armenia and around the Caspian Sea. They moved south, conquered Egypt, other parts of Africa. And so we see some correlation there. But then really, kind of like last chapter where a lot of the focus was on the fourth empire, the focus really turns to the third empire here. And we're told again exactly what the goat represents, and that's the Greek Empire. All right. So it comes from the west, we see. All right. You know your geography. If I had prepared more, I would have put a map up for you so you could kind of get a sense of these things. But if you have a general sense of geography, Greece is west of Persia. Okay. And we're told there's this prominent horn which represents what? Yeah, it's the first king, and we would say that's Alexander the Great. Now, Alexander the Great is not the first Greek king or ruler, all right? If you know a little bit of history, for a long time, Greece was really kind of a collection of city-states. And so if you've heard of Sparta or Athens, these were kind of city-states that at times may have had alliances or been arranged into leagues, but they were never really a unified empire until Alexander the Great. So he reigns beginning in 336 BC. And if you know anything about Alexander the Great, you know that he was a very good military tactician and leader. And very quickly, he conquers much of the known world. And so the description here of the goat is that it goes over the surface of the entire earth without touching the ground. All right, almost kind of like flying. And that kind of makes me think, at least, of the leopard from chapter 7. What did the leopard have? Wings, right? And that represented the Greek Empire. So that perhaps is symbolizing the tremendous speed with which Alexander the Great conquered much of the known world. Went all the way from Greece, all the way to India, into Africa. But then we see that there's going to be conflict between these two nations in verses 6 and 7. All right, and that symbolizes the conflict between the Medo-Persian Empire and the Greek Empire. What's interesting is you see that it's not like they just kind of happen to meet along the riverbank and are fighting over, territory, right? It seems like there's something behind this, and we're told that in verse 6, the goat is wrathful, is angered by this. All right. It rushes at the ram with mighty wrath. It's enraged at him. Again, if you know a little bit about history, even before Alexander the Great, there was a lot of conflict between the Medo-Persians and the Greeks. All right, the Greco-Persian wars, where these city-states in Greece would constantly fight with Persia. Persia tried to invade Greece on multiple occasions, leading up to what would eventually become the Greek Empire under Alexander the Great. So you can see why there might be, by the time you come to Alexander the Great's reign, there might be some animosity. These are not just two neighboring nations that just happen to be next to each other. They really seem to not like each other for a lot of different reasons. Alexander the Great is going to, of course, dominate the Medo-Persian Empire, and that's what we see illustrated in this. The goat dominates the ram, tramples over it. We see that illustrated here. Then in verse 8, we're told the goat makes himself exceedingly great, as we see with Alexander the Great and his empire. If you look up his battle record, it's pretty much unblemished. There's not really a loss that we would associate with Alexander the Great. And so he became very powerful. But the thing is, like we've seen with all these other nations, they're not eternal, they're not lasting. And so this empire was fragile as well. In verse 8 it says, "But once he became powerful, the large horn was broken." All right, so Alexander the Great, after doing all this conquering, he's going to die at a very young age, at I think 30, in 323 BC. And the problem, as we alluded to last week, was that he didn't have a successor. All right, And it said that he said his successor should be whoever the strongest was. And so then for the next several decades, that's exactly what they tried to figure out, was who was going to be the strongest. And so we're told that 4 horns take the place of this one prominent horn, and we're told later on in the chapter that this represents 4 kingdoms. And lo and behold, that's exactly what happens in history. All right, we have 4 kingdoms that are going to take over for the Greek Empire. And so I think you may have those in your hand. The Ptolemaic, the Seleucid, the Pergamon, and the Macedon. All right, so all right. So then we have the next element that really becomes a big part of the focus. We have this little horn starting in verse 9. So we've got the 4 kingdoms that arise, and out of one of those kingdoms, we're told that a small horn grew exceedingly great towards the south, toward the east, and toward the beautiful land. So verse 23 again gives us our explanation of what is being talked about there. In the latter period of their dominion, so in the latter period of these 4 kingdoms, when the wrongdoers have run their course, a king will arise, insolent and skilled in intrigue. So a king is going to rise. And I want you to notice, and just make a note here, there's kind of similar imagery from chapter 7, right? We saw the same thing, that you had these horns coming out of the 4th beast, right? You had 10 horns and then 1 little horn. We kind of see the same imagery here. We've got 4 horns and then 1 little horn that comes out of that. We're not talking about the same thing here. Even though the imagery is the same in chapter 7, we're talking about the Roman period. Here we're talking about the Greek period. All right. So we've got this little horn. Most conservative scholars would agree, just kind of jumping ahead, that this is referring to Antiochus Epiphanes. Antiochus the 4th, who would later become known as Antiochus Epiphanes. He was a ruler in one of those 4 kingdoms, the Seleucid kingdom, from 175 BC to 164 BC. All right, and there are a lot of connections in these verses that we'll talk about that give us reason to believe that that's what's being talked about here. All right, so verse 11, we're told that it, being this king, even exalted itself to be equal with the commander of the army. Well, Epiphanes, the name that Antiochus gave himself, means God manifest. All right, so you can see the attitude he has there. Verse 24 says that this king is going to be skilled in intrigue, that is power. He'll have power, but not by his own power, that he's going to be charismatic and powerful. And that's what we see with Antiochus when we look at history. He was a powerful leader. He was very charismatic. He was the type that would, as he's going through the streets, throw out coins to the peasants to make them like him and things like that. But so a lot of these things seem to fit. If we think about the expansion of this Seleucid kingdom, expansion under Antiochus, it seems to fit the description there of how this kingdom will expand south toward the east, toward the beautiful land. Toward the south, Antiochus tries to expand south towards Egypt. What do you think the beautiful land might refer to? Israel, yeah. I think that's what's being contemplated there when we see beautiful land. I think it's talking about the promised land in Jerusalem. And so Antiochus is going to push his way down to Egypt, doesn't have 100% success down there. And when he's coming back from Egypt, he's going to go into Jerusalem and attack the people in Jerusalem, okay? Now, there's different historical explanations as to why Antiochus Epiphanes would do this. Some say that he suspected there was a rebellion, and so he went and wiped them out essentially to quash that rebellion. I'm going to suggest as we get towards the end that there's more than just a secular historical reason for why all this happens, so we'll come to that. But in 168 BC, Antiochus Epiphanes goes into Jerusalem and he's going to execute many Jews, all right? If you've heard of the Maccabean revolt, this is all the events that lead to the Maccabean revolt, okay? There's 2 books written about the Maccabean revolt, 1st and 2nd Maccabees. You may have heard of that. Let me read you a quote from 2nd Maccabees describing what was done in Jerusalem by Antiochus Epiphanes. It says, when these happenings were reported to the king, these things that they think led him to do these things, he thought that Judea was in revolt. Raging like a wild animal, he set out from Egypt and took Jerusalem by storm. He ordered his soldiers to cut down without mercy those whom they met and slay those who took refuge in their houses. There was a massacre of young and old, a killing of women and children, a slaughter of virgins and infants. In the space of 3 days, 80,000 were lost, 40,000 meeting a violent death, killed, and the same number being sold into slavery. All right, so that's from the 2nd book of Maccabees, a description of what happens there. So if we come back to our text in Daniel 8, thinking about what's being done there, going back to verse 24, and his power will be mighty, but not by his own power, and he will destroy to an extraordinary degree and be successful and do as he pleases, and he will destroy mighty men and the holy people. All right. So we've got the time period. This gives us the time period during when this is going to happen. It's going to be a king that arises out of these 4 kingdoms, all right, towards the end of those. All right, so Antiochus Epiphanes is towards the end of that kingdom. All right, so the timing fits. And then when we look at the description of what takes place, it fits. So he's going to go in, he's going to kill lots of people, execute people, put people into slavery. But then here's really what's significant to our text. He then bans Jewish religious worship and observances, and he defiles the temple. So he goes into the temple, sets up an altar to Zeus. Okay. He then sacrifices a pig in the temple. All right. So if you're familiar with the law of Moses, you know why that's a big problem. Okay. So sacrificing an unclean animal to a pagan god in the temple, just triple whammy there. All right, now come back to our text again, verse 11. What are we told? It even exalted itself to be equal with the commander of the army, and it removed the regular sacrifice from him, and the place of his sanctuary was overthrown. Exactly what you see Antiochus Epiphanes doing. So he eliminates temple worship, sets up shrines, pagan altars throughout the city, in the countryside in Judea. And so we see events there that very closely correspond with what's being talked about in chapter 8 here. So that's why there's a lot of agreement as to that Antiochus Epiphanes and those events are what's being talked about and being prophesied here. So if we're talking about the 160s, 170s BC, we're talking, 400 or so years into the future from Daniel's perspective. So this is going to lead to the Maccabean revolt, again, that you may have heard about. Judas Maccabees is going to lead a revolt. Eventually they're going to capture Jerusalem, the Jewish rebels. In 164 BC, they're going to cleanse the temple. They're going to rededicate it and establish the Feast of Dedication, which does that sound familiar to anyone? John chapter 10. Jesus and his followers come to Jerusalem for around the time of the Feast of Dedication. We call it something different nowadays. Anybody know what it is? Hanukkah. Yeah. So Hanukkah is the Feast of Dedication, which is all based around the cleansing and rededication of the temple after all of this taking place. Okay. So we're given some indications about time and how long. We're given indications, as we talked about when this is going to happen. But we also have some clues as to how long this might happen. If you go back to verse 14, it says, "And he said to me, for 2,300 evenings and mornings, then the sanctuary will be properly restored." Okay, so 2,300 days. So there's a couple of interpretations people have for what the 2,300 days means. It could roughly fit the time period. If you divide that into years, it could roughly fit the period of Antiochus Epiphanes doing this, and then the ensuing conflict with the rebels Some believe it's a reference to the morning and evening sacrifices, and so you should actually divide that by 2 to get the number of days. I don't want to spend too much time on math, but that would give you 1150 days. And so some would say that corresponds to the time where temple worship was actually eliminated, around 3 years. It could just be merely symbolic. So again, that's one of those things we can get into the weeds about. I don't think it really changes the overall message of what's being talked about, though. The other note I want to make about time, though, is this: what's said to Daniel, "Son of man, understand that the vision pertains to the time of the end." So, as we talked about last week, when people hear, that we're going to talk about apocalyptic literature, they automatically want to jump to end times, right? Jesus' return, things like that. Same thing here. When people hear the time of the end, they automatically want to jump to the end, the ultimate end, right? And that is where some people take this. I don't think there's support for it in the text. But if we think about what's being said, the timing of this, what we see in the vision and its interpretation, these things pertain to the end of the Greek period. They also pertain to the end of what you might call the Jewish period, all right? It takes place towards the end of the BC period, right? Not long after all this, what's going to happen? The Messiah is going to come, and the eternal kingdom is going to be established. Okay? But what I want to talk about for the rest of our time is why this happens. All right? Is there anything in what we read and what we talked, what clues do we have? Because I think if you read this is God, if we take the position that God is doing this, which I will, why would he do this to the Jewish people, his chosen people? Why might this happen? Is there anything in the text that we read that would give us an indication? What do you think? Mm.
God says, I'm in God. You must pray. And then he going back to Exodus to Deuteronomy. You know that other nations know the thankful and kind of take over you. That's what happened for kingdom. Mm-hmm. In the end, God's not one of my faith. Right? They're submitted to God.
So notice verse 12. And because of an offense, the army will be given to the horn along with the regular sacrifice. Then in verse 23, and when in the latter period of their dominion, when the wrongdoers have run their course. All right, I think what's happening here is that this is once again judgment by God against the Jews for their continued sinfulness. All right, so who is behind this? God. We're told that it's not his own power, it's not Antiochus' own power that's behind this, it is God. Okay, so the vision, I think, indicates to us that all this is going to be done, is going to take place as God's response to the sinfulness of the Jews. Now think about this for a moment. This is, again, 160s, 170s BC. So what all has happened from the time of Daniel to that point? Temple's destroyed. They return. They rebuild the temple, rebuild the city, reinstitute temple worship. And now a few hundred years later, what seems to have happened is they've gotten right back into what got them into Babylonian captivity in the first place. Essentially, when you come to the time of Antiochus Epiphanes, we're right back to where we started in Daniel chapter 1. Judgment proclaimed against the people of God because of their sinfulness. Okay, so I think what we see here is God giving the people over to Antiochus for a time, just as we read in chapter 1 of Daniel, God giving over the people of Judah to Nebuchadnezzar. So I think that's what's happening here. So the answer to the question, about who is doing this, who's bringing this about is God. But that's not the end of the story, because who is also going to be judged at the end of all this? Antiochus is going to be judged. Antiochus is going to be judged. In verse 25, and through his shrewdness he will make deceit a success by his influence, and he will make himself great in his own mind, and he will destroy many while they are at ease. He will even oppose the prince of princes, but he will be broken without human agency. So he too is going to be broken without human agency. So God is the answer to why does this happen to the Jews? Who's the answer to what's going to happen to Antiochus? Same thing. God is going to judge. So God used Antiochus, I think, just as God used Nebuchadnezzar to pronounce judgment on the Jews. But that doesn't mean that Antiochus had a free pass for the rest of his life, right? Antiochus was still accountable to God, okay? So there's still hope. This persecution's going to end. Antiochus's reign's going to end. And then, of course, ultimately we have the hope of the Messiah. But what I want us to see as we wrap this up. So if we were to put all these events, this period of Antiochus Epiphanes and this revolt, if we were to put it on a timeline of the biblical time period, all right, so you think about the patriarchs, the Exodus, the period of the judges, those time periods, what period would we put this in? Intertestamental period. What's another term we use for that period? So, is biblical silence, or the period of silence. All right. So we say that's the period in which God's not involved in the people's lives. God's silent. There's no prophecy, things like that. But what I want us to see is God may have been silent during that period, but he was not silent about that period. Because here what we have is God prophesying about things that are going to come to pass during that period of so-called silence. He may have been silent, but what we see is he's still, what? In control. He's still carrying out his purpose. He's still carrying out judgment in the nations and in the lives of men. So we got a minute or two left. That's pretty much what I wanted to cover. Is there any questions? Are you just ready to pass out?
You know, Daniel had these visions, and I understand what he's speaking of Daniel, but the read the book before Daniel, Ezekiel, oh my goodness, God's given him all these visions of exactly what God is asking, you know, that's like a
Yeah.
and he started with the Israelites and broken feet also.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, it's interesting to me. It's really interesting to me. I don't know if it is to you to read the reaction of Daniel to these visions. So kind of like we read, Daniel at the end of chapter 7, he's alarmed, he's disturbed. He doesn't seem to fully understand everything. And we see the exact same thing here at the end of verse 27 in chapter 8. Then I, Daniel, was exhausted and sick for days. Then I got up and carried on the king's business, but I was astounded at the vision, and there was no one to explain it. So, that just really strikes me that Daniel himself is astounded and disturbed by this. But I think it makes sense when you consider, again, that historical context. Daniel's in this period where the nation of Israel has been destroyed, but what does he know? Because he has the words of Jeremiah, as we're going to talk about, not next week because we're off, but very soon we're going to talk about how he knows that this exile is going to end, that they're going to return, that the people are going to be restored. Okay, and so what's going to happen is that Jerusalem's going to be rebuilt, the temple is going to be rebuilt, and so think about all that's going to happen. Things are going to go well, and then what is Daniel hearing about? Basically the exact same thing that's already happened. So you can imagine why he would just be disturbed and distraught by all of these things as he hears about them. He's told to seal up in verse 26, and we'll leave off of this. Verse 26, and the vision of the evenings and mornings which has been told is true, but as for you, keep the vision secret, because it pertains to many days in the future. So he's to preserve this This is something that the people during those days, during the time of Antiochus Epiphanes, they would have been able to read and understand why these things are happening and know this is when these things are being fulfilled. We need to remain faithful, just as Daniel, as he's facing kind of the same situation, was to remain faithful. Just as we see persecution and opposition to the people of God, we need to remain faithful. So that's, if you will, the takeaway for us. Whatever happens, whether we're facing someone like Antiochus Epiphanes, there is still an opportunity to be faithful and do the right thing in any circumstance. Any other questions? All right, so we will start on chapter 1. We're going to be off next week. I think it's Bill Bynum next week. So we'll be off. So you got plenty of time to read chapter 9 and get ready for all that the following week. So we'll see you then.